Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by John Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Jim Curcuruto of the Outdoor Stewards of Conservation Foundation. John and Jim will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our hosts of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, John and Jim.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Connected with Conservation, the only podcast that goes behind the scenes to look at the business of conservation in our country. I'm John Gassett with the Wildlife Management Institute, and I'm your co-host with Connected with Conservation, here with my fellow co-host today, Jim Curcuruto. Jim, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I just trying to think here. Connect with Conservation podcast. I know. We've got to talk a lot about hunting, fishing, trapping, and shooting, and participating in those is awesome because there's so many. It's not just I'm going hunting, right? Are you going small game hunting? You're going upland hunting? You're going waterfowl? Same thing with fishing, trapping, even target shooting. A lot of disciplines. But, I've had some conversations about when I go hunting, there's different levels of hunting. Let's say, squirrel hunting, kind of easy to do, let's say, beginners. But then you move up the ladder as maybe you're hunting. I think kind of toward the top of that ladder is what we're going to be talking about today. I've never done it, probably never will, but it's seems pretty cool, but a lot of cool things that we're going to talk about today about wild sheep. And who better to talk to wild sheep about than our guest, Corey Mason, who's the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of Conservation at Wild Sheep Foundation. So hopefully I got all your title right and stuff, but welcome, Corey. Good to have you, and I'm excited about talking about wild sheep. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself first?
You bet. Well, gentlemen, thanks for having me. I appreciate that. Yeah, Corey Mason with Wild Sheep Foundation, and I've spent a career in wildlife conservation from undergraduate degrees, graduate degrees, a couple of years guiding big game out west, and then started a career with Texas Parks and Wildlife, and was with the agency for 16 plus years. Started out as a management area biologist working on public lands, really managing everything from the habitat work, from wetlands to hardwood management, forestry operations to putting prescribed fire on the ground, research programs as well, public hunting programs, and really kind of the full gamut of that. And then worked on a number of WMAs for years, and then moved into some of the program work based out of Austin, Texas, and then was there for a few years. And I guess the last 5 years of my time, I was a regional director for the wildlife division. And so certainly worked with a lot of our mutual acquaintances and friends in conservation, obviously at the state level, but then had the opportunity to work across a lot of states and with our Fish and Wildlife Service friends and some of our colleagues south of the border in Mexico as well, and some collaborative work. And then from there, moved into the nonprofit world and sort of turned the page there a little bit, and worked for Dallas Safari Club as CEO for about 7 years, and enjoyed that greatly. Worked all over the world in conservation planning, literally all over the world, and with management authorities and CITES and Convention of Migratory Species and a lot of the international theaters and platforms and IUCN, et cetera. And of course, a lot of political work associated with that in Washington, D.C. from a policy standpoint, and enjoying the wild sheep family, and really enjoy the work here. And one of the greatest things about it is putting dollars on the ground for conservation of species. And that's one of the greatest things this foundation does so well.
Right. Well, I'm relatively new to, understanding sheep. John and I were talking about it a little bit before, but tell me a little bit about Wild Sheep Foundation, the mission, when it started, and, what you guys are up to now.
You bet. So the Wild Sheep Foundation, of all the organizations that are out there, from maybe a non-hunting participant standpoint, maybe one of the least known. They may be familiar with organizations like Ducks Unlimited and maybe National Wild Turkey Federation. Huge memberships and fantastic organizations that do great work. Conservation work specifically. But the Wild Sheep Foundation it's a smaller organization, but extremely effective. We have roughly 11,000 members from all over the world, and a mission that's really clear and simple. It's to put and keep wild sheep on the mountain. And so with a very narrow mission statement, it allows us to not lose focus, to not get off on some of those tangential things. We deliver conservation projects for wild sheep, and we very specifically work really, really close with our agency partners. And if that's state agencies, federal agencies, provincial governments to the north in Canada, a lot of our First Nation and tribal agencies across North America, obviously in the Western United States. And then Mexico, we have with a Mexico coalition that we work really closely with. And then the last few years, we worked really strategically to build a Central Asian sort of a working group, if you will, and a number of the sand countries with some of their mountain ungulate species. And so that's really got some traction in the last 2 years. And we can talk about that more in a bit if you'd like. But it's some real capacity there. So our footprint is wide, and obviously within the North America, of course, it's constrained to the Western U.S., which is where sheep historically occur. Our work is delivered typically through partners like our agencies.
Yeah. So Corey, just for our listeners, because a lot of them, like you said, may not know about wild sheep. Pretty much everybody probably knows we deer hunt and squirrel hunt and all that, but they may not know much about sheep or sheep hunting. So they obviously they're Western species, mountainous species, but fairly range limited, right? Because they're they're not a prairie species. They're living on the tops of the mountains. So a little bit about the natural history, about the natural history of sheep and where they live, and how they're so difficult to get to and work with.
You bet. So they are a difficult species to study, to access, to manage because of where they live, to your point. And it's typically very remote, rugged terrain. And if we start sort of in the southern United States and in Mexico, that's the desert bighorn sheep range, which ranges in the southern U.S., obviously Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. And then if we move north, we move into a bighorn sheep range, which is, if you've been to Colorado or Wyoming or those kind of states, that's probably the species that you saw. And then as we continue to move north and we move into Alaska specifically, that big, beautiful white sheep with the beautiful kind of wide flare, that's a Dall sheep. And then if we move into Canada to the east a bit, that kind of white charcoal gray sheep is a stone sheep. And those are, we call thin horn sheep, the stone and the Dall. They have typically more wide sweeping horns, beautiful. They're heavy, but they're not like their southern brother in the desert and the bighorn sheep that have those just giant, massive horns that you typically see just slamming the horns into each other on those beautiful videos. That's typically bighorns.
Good deal. Good deal. Well, so I've heard this adage before, and I always get it mixed up. But I've heard people talk about when they hunt sheep, it's like you got to walk through goat country to get to sheep country, or vice versa. Sometimes I think if I'm talking to the goat people, they say they're the ones that are harder to get to, and if I talk to sheep people, they say they're. How do those species sort of fall out? I mean, they do occur in similar habitats, but tell us a little bit about because some people may not know that there is a difference between those two, between mountain goats and sheep.
You bet. So that's a great point, John. So, mountain goats are for those that don't know, those beautiful kind of long-haired white species that have those, say, 8 to 10 inch kind of black horns that curve back just a little bit. You typically will find those across, you can find them certainly in the U.S. and the far northwestern U.S., clearly into Alaska, and then a number of provinces in Canada as well. And they do live obviously high altitude, and they, like sheep, will move based on, of course, environmental conditions, and then ultimately, of course, forage and food conditions. The ability to move up and access those mountaintops, slopes as the wind, of course, clears snow off and access the forage under them. But yes, both of those species, being sheep in the aggregate, and of course mountain goats. If you hear of someone that's hunting either of those species, they have earned that hunt. They have worked hard. They prepared hard. They got their equipment prepared. They were probably really proficient with their rifle, and they went to the mountain in good shape.
Yeah, and probably had a lot of time to take off work to do it. It's not you don't go
exactly
you don't go on a 3-day sheep hunt.
No, you don't. Those are typically 10 days to 20. So they're a long time for sure.
Right. And, we talk about, there's a reason why the sheep are there, right? I mean, we'll get into some of the, the things that they seem like a hardy animal, but they can be delicate. There's disease, there's predation, there's all sorts of things. But the reason why they're there is because of conservation. And last time I was at a conference with you at your luncheon, you put a slide up there that said, Wild Sheep Foundation had done over $110 million worth of conservation work. And I think I asked you afterwards, was that a typo? Is there an extra zero there? But, we like to talk about $10 million a day, 3.6 billion a year, but that's mostly from excise taxes and license sales. So adding in the stuff that you guys are doing. So talk a little, I mean, is that the correct number, or, and what type of stuff do you do with that?
Yeah, first of all, you have a great memory, Jim. Yes, so to date, Wild Sheep Foundation has delivered over $110 million in conservation projects. And again, I'll probably be really repetitive about this, but it's something I think to be really proud of as an entire community, that those are dollars that are going on the ground. They're going to, on the ground active habitat projects, from literally turning the plow into the ground, to forest projects, to prescribed fire, water restoration, everything in between. And I think an important part of that, if we look at mission program funding just from last year, and you can envision what mission program funding is. Again, that's dollars to agencies. That's our grant and aid program, and that's supporting our conservation action specifically. We spent over 11.5 million last year just in mission program delivery and funding specifically. And so again, that's meeting critical needs of the conservation of that species. And I keep talking about agencies, and I think it's important for maybe me to underscore why. It's because we work really closely with those closest on the ground. And within our conservation staff, we have whatever the number is, 100 probably plus years of on the ground conservation actions within our team. But to identify, work collaboratively with these conservation partners, what are the most pressing needs? And then we fund those needs, and we work through what's called our Professional Resource Advisory Board, which is another board of 5 or 6 long-standing retired either wildlife health professionals, meaning wildlife veterinarians with state agencies formerly, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service biologists, and state agency biologists, so that we ensure then when we're reviewing the distribution of our grant and aid program that we are putting dollars on the most critical and pressing needs. And so if we look at like the current year, we went through that cycle in early in the fall, like September-ish, and we identified 25 projects that we're funding. And those range from Mexico, again, all the way across the U.S. into Alaska, specifically aimed at Dall sheep, as you would expect in Alaska. And then in Central Asia, this year, we're specifically significant, hundreds of thousands of dollars funding a project over there to perform for the first time ever baseline range-wide surveys for their mountain ungulates, which has never been done. So it's a huge undertaking. And of course, in collaboration, we'll be partnering with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and sharing that information. And so the sum of these projects this year alone is $2.2+ million for these projects. And so it is getting it done on the ground.
Yeah, that's impressive numbers, for any organization. But y'all aren't a huge organization, are you? I mean, compared to some of the other critter groups, you're outsizing your money dollars on the ground for the people you got working there and your membership. It's a fairly exclusive group of I would think of sheep members of Wild Sheep Foundation.
You're exactly right. The community isn't huge compared to duck hunters or deer hunters or whatever at large, but it's an incredibly generous and passionate community, that gives sacrificially in many times, and of course we have events through the year and work with our chapter affiliates and partners, which are such great partners and help deliver on the ground projects within their states or groups of states as well. And so, it's really that kind of tribe concept. It's we can be great as a partner, and it's big partnerships that get it done.
I definitely want to talk a little bit about, that more. But as you were talking, we mentioned earlier that there's you see the videos of them rams smashing each other. You think, man, that's a hardy animal. But the disease and predation and just habitat, can affect them pretty substantially. So I guess talk some about what are some of the things that you guys are really focusing on? Is it disease, habitat, predation, anything else, or?
Yeah, great question. So I'll kind of split that in half. And so from a habitat standpoint, we're really looking at some aggressive measures to manage these species because, if we look several decades ago, sheep numbers were at historic lows. And now through a lot of applied conservation. The sheep are rebounding, but can do a lot better in a lot of places. And in some places, in some states, they're doing extremely well. But these habitat projects vary. When you look at, let me back up, some of the environmental challenges, when you look at Alaska, some extremely hard winters the last couple of years have resulted in a significant loss of Dall sheep across a portion of Alaska. Well, the natural assumption is there's not much we can do about that, and there may not be, but we're certainly investigating what can we do. It would amaze you the number of sheep that are lost in avalanches and things like that. Again, things that you can't do anything about that really, but what are range conditions like? What are the health status of those sheep as they go into these really hard winters? Are they as physically fit as they can be to try to prepare for some extreme winters? And those are the things that we can potentially impact. And so that's then a direct result of habitat quality and conditions. And those where we're doing a lot of work in that capacity. You move over just a little bit to the east in British Columbia, and we move to the Yukon, and we're looking at prescribed fire there in thin-horn sheep habitat, and how can we improve forage conditions, increase visibility to reduce predation, and you alluded to that a while ago, Jim, exactly. And so things like that we can do on the ground there. And then we move all the way down south, and we look at trying to increase water distribution so that sheep can have basically access to more parts of historic range. And so there's a lot of habitat work like that, if it's forage and seeding in the west or whatever it might be. Noxious invasive weed control, some of those things that have been brought in as a result of farming practices and livestock. And again, prescribed fire, a tremendous tool. Now we sort of look at the other side of the coin that you mentioned a while ago, disease. Disease is a absolutely giant issue for wild sheep management. It's been an issue for years, and it continues to rear its ugly head. And so we spent many millions of dollars on trying to, all the way down to strain typing, a specific type of pneumonia that's typically passed from domestic livestock, specifically sheep and potentially goats as well, to wild sheep. And wild sheep are very susceptible to it. They can't be vaccinated for it. Obviously, we talked about, where wild sheep live, and it's not something we would even do anyways. But nonetheless, and in many of these places where summer grazing programs result in domestic sheep being grazed at a high elevation, there's the opportunity for sheep to interact. And that can be a domestic sheep production from a farming standpoint, or someone that maybe has a hobby flock, that wants to have 10 sheep behind their house on 10 acres. Well, if you have a ram on the hill that comes down and interacts with those sheep, well, he can give the gift of taking that disease right back to the herd. And it's often fatal. And it has a significant impact, negative impact, that is, on recruitment on lambs the following year. They don't survive it well. And then it takes years to get pneumonia out of that herd. We're doing some projects called test and remove, where you come back and test a herd. You test them multiple times to see if they're the chronic carriers, because some pass immediately and some are worse than that, in which they persist and they continue to spread that pneumonia to many others. And so it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving in a negative way. So lots and lots of work on that. Working with some of the best, wildlife veterinarians and disease pathologists in the world on those particular challenges. And so that's very real, and it's a big effort.
Yeah. So just to follow up to that, so I know I've seen several documentaries y'all been involved in on the sheep pneumonia issue, and for people who aren't aware of the issue or what it does to them, it's you may look at it and say, well, they're euthanizing these sheep. If test positive, they euthanize them, they kill them, get them out, and it's like, but that's really the better thing for the herd. The sheep's not going to recover. You really don't want to walk around infecting all the other sheep. If you can remove it from as an infection source, it's the humane thing to do is get that animal out of the mix.
That's exactly right. So then that animal is no longer persisting and continuing to spread that pneumonia throughout the herd. And then you have, so they're not necessarily geographically isolated as well. They have a herd, but then it doesn't mean herds don't come together around water sources or around certain times a year. And so, yeah, you can literally see a disease work its way through and across a mountain range. And so all the way down to strain typing, these varieties of pneumonia and seeing where they're going, how they got there, and then understanding how those sheep are moving. And so, yeah, huge effort with that to try to mitigate as best we can, and then work with these state agencies. In fact, we actually have a grant and aid project right now through the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to look at the combined efforts of all of these states and their test and remove programs as to how effective were they, what worked, what didn't work, sort of the one strike you're out, two strike you're out, intervals of testing, all of that to determine sort of the best formula, if you will, going forward of how can we then kind of package this. And there's never a one size fit all, if you will, but we can certainly come up with recommendations on what worked best and what didn't work well at all. So we can, learn from our successes and learn from our failures.
Yeah. Yeah, the best analogy I've known and talked about is chronic wasting disease, because people do hear more about that in deer and elk than they do, pneumonia in sheep. But it's like we would never put our hands on an infected CWD positive deer that's alive and then turn it back into the wild. It's you get your hands on it, you take the typhoid Mary out of the group. So yeah. Another follow up on what affects sheep, because this is just something I'm not a sheep biologist. More of a ungulate or big game elk and deer biologist. But what about do they migrate much? Or migration corridor issues? And you mentioned prescribed fire, but how do wildfires affect them? And then the third thing I had was human disturbance. I mean, obviously they're in tough places, but I know those things have a significant impact on species like elk and mule deer and all that. But didn't know if they affect sheep as much or not, or if they're fairly stationary where they stay, or they are largely above where the fires occur. But there's just been a ton of wildfires in the West in the past, decade or so. So didn't know if that's affecting the sheep.
You bet all three of those do affect sheep. From a wildfire standpoint, as you well know and pointed out, from a deer and an elk standpoint, can be significant impacts immediately for the first couple of years based on intensity of fire. And then following that, it can improve habitat quality, obviously, depending on, the intensity of the fire. But yes, it can certainly move sheep, and human disturbance, a very real thing as well. Typically don't think about that from backcountry, if it's someone that's out hiking or whatever it might be, or just human disturbance in general. But these wildlife corridors, really across some of the major highways, there's some very specific places in which some of those things are being put in with sheep in mind, because there's some significant areas where, kind of counterintuitive to most people, where sheep are not opposed to coming down and using like salt licks. That's a very common thing, naturally occurring licks and mineral licks. And in fact, the number of sheep are hit each year hit on the side of the highway when they're coming down and using salt that's been applied for road treatments. And so there's those kind of things occur, and it's an unfortunate byproduct of just civilization. That's what it is. But ways to mitigate that, absolutely. So all of those are things that cumulatively do impact sheep populations.
So what are the main predators? I'm thinking in my head, but I assume the main predators that are taking their fair share of sheep.
Yeah, so certainly mountain lion would be very high on the list, and it depends on sort of where you are. But mountain lion would be number one, and then bears to some extent as well. We've seen from our projects in Canada as well, wolverines killing a few sheep as well, which I would have lost money on that, but yes, we're seeing that. And then, as you would expect, anything that wolves, obviously, if sheep is around and they can obviously locate them, obviously quick to take a sheep as well. So, but across the West, generally speaking, and even to the South, mountain lions would be one of the the more larger predators that would be most typically thought of.
I'm assuming golden eagles as well will prey on young sheep.
They certainly could, absolutely.
Seen a video or two of that. Those are some of the most classic videos I've ever seen, is those eagles coming down and taking a lamb. And it's like, in that extremely rugged terrain, you wonder there's not more crashes than there are when they try to do that.
It's brutal to see, but it's you're exactly right. Most people don't think about that from a lambing standpoint, but those big, large and avian carnivores like that are, absolutely significant, sometimes seasonally.
Well, you got your hands full, Corey. I mean, a lot going on there. But you mentioned the dedication of the members of Wild Sheep Foundation, and I assume that's where a lot of the funding comes from. I mean, $2.5 million this year, $110 million overall. So I guess talk a little bit about the funding, sources that you have there. And I know you have a trade show, an annual trade show, and there's tags and stuff like that auctioned off. So.
Yeah, you bet. Great point, Jim. Number one, there's a very significant donor base that just give philanthropically because they believe in conservation. They're fulfilled in doing so, and we're so grateful to that base of members that just give. They just simply write checks to support the programs, and that's a significant part of the sort of the pillar of conservation funding for Wild Sheep Foundation. And then we also have some really generous supporters that supply us and support us from a corporate standpoint. Corporate sponsors as well, and Bass Pro Cabela's and their outdoor fund. I mean, folks like that just continue to support us at a very significant level, and that kind of funding is obviously critical as well. And then lastly, to your point, we have a very significant annual event. We call it the Sheep Show. And it's in Reno every year, Reno, Nevada. And this year it's January 22nd through the 24th. So coming up very soon for us. And it is really the gathering of Western hunter from all over, folks that just really enjoy that way of life. And it's a 3-day event, but we have a lot of meetings on the front end, as many of these things do. Like, for example, we host the WAFA Wild Sheep Initiative meeting on the front end. We have, of course, then all our state agency folks are there, and provincial governments, and tribes and First Nation partners as well. And then through that 3 days, of course, we have, lots of events and raffles. And then at night we have auctions, like you alluded to. And at those banquets, we support our state agency partners specifically through what we call our conservation permit sales. And those that might not be familiar with the conservation permits, others maybe call them governor's tags or minister's tags, things like that, in which we'll use a state agency as an example, but it applies to really all those other groups that I've mentioned already, where a state agency allocates 1 or 2 tags. We'll just use sheep as the example here, and other species apply as well. And they typically will donate, for simplicity, I'll say 1 of each, a tag to auction and a tag to raffle. And they provide 2 different purposes. The raffle is more available for people within their state, although raffles are really complicated and they create a lot of challenges as well. But there's a raffle, and then there's an auction tag. Wild Sheep Foundation has really created the environment and really the marketplace to auction those tags. And we auction around 30 of those permits each year. Most of those are for sheep, but we do elk, we've had pronghorn, bear, moose, a number of other species as well, going back to support those agencies. And the important thing about that from a wild sheep management standpoint is that kind of all the way back to John's point earlier about, not as well known a species, not as many people have the opportunity to hunt sheep just because of population levels, and not as many people have the ability to hunt sheep physically. But all that said, sheep are not a species that through permit sales, license sales, pay for their own management. They're not a waterfowl species, and they're not a white-tailed deer. So it required a unique funding model to be able to support the conservation actions of these species. We've talked about how remote they are multiple times here. Well, that just means things are expensive to do anything with them. It's a helicopter, it's a boat, it's a whatever, to do any kind of conservation action. And so what's interesting is these conservation permits support 83% of our agency partners' funding. So these conservation permits are literally the lifeblood for their ability to maintain their biologists, do surveys, do conservation actions, health assessments, population management, and all of that. And so we do have the privilege of partnering with many. Again, we sell about 30 of these a year. And last year, we sent back to our state agency partners over $6.8 million. And then you guys both know that's non-federal dollars. So then that can be matched with PR right on top of that. So that's a big number really fast.
Yeah, it's impressive numbers, especially from, like I said, from a group of small, dedicated people, primarily that can, like you said, have the ability to go sheep hunting, either financially or physically. You don't go through, and research wise, you don't go out for an afternoon of sheep capture.
That's right.
It may take 4 days to get to where the sheep are. Then you're going to do the capture. So it's an expensive proposition, but they're certainly an iconic Western species. So we appreciate all you do there. So.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always learn something on these podcasts, even when I think I know a topic, but I knew I'd learn a lot today. So I appreciate you filling everybody in on that. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to hit on. If not, we can talk about where to get more information.
Yeah, you bet. No, I think, if someone's interested in supporting, I guess one of the things that I would just sort of underscore for anyone that's listening, if it's Wild Sheep Foundation or Ducks Unlimited or wherever it might be, that these conservation organizations do a lot of good. They support our agency partners. They alone, again, come along beside our federal agency as well and help deliver needed habitat and needed shoulders, if you will, to, put the shovel on the ground and help in a way. So that's one great way people can engage, is just find the organization that you believe in and choose to be a member and support them because it really makes a difference.
Yeah, and you have your web address? If you give that to us, we can put it up for our
You
viewers
bet.
as well. So
Yeah, so obviously folks can find us at Wild Sheep Foundation, all the social channels as well, and I can provide those to you gentlemen. And yeah, we'd love to answer any questions anybody might has about what we're doing and how we're getting it done.
good deal. Good deal. Well, Corey, thanks for coming on. Y'all are doing great work. I always sheep fascinate me. I've never hunted them. I always wanted to. So if you come across a discounted sheep tag somewhere along the way, holler at me. I may be interested, but I got to do it pretty quick. I'll get too old to be able to get up and down those mountains. So, but thanks for everything y'all are doing. You're doing great work. To our listeners, think about some of these conservation organizations, the money they spend and their members spend to do conservation on the ground for our iconic species in this country. Go check out their website, see what they do, see what they offer, look at all the great projects they fund, and consider becoming a member or making a donation. The money goes to conservation. You may never hunt a sheep, you may never hunt an elk, you may never hunt a bear, but if you like clean water, clean rivers, clean streams, clean outdoors, healthy environments, clean air, it's all pinned to conservation, good conservation on the ground. So support these groups, consider supporting these groups. Thanks for everything that you do. Please, if you like this episode, subscribe to us and give us a thumbs up to it or like. And other than that, we'll see you in the woods or on the water. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.